recently spoke with someone who works at a lending company in the traditional tech space who's kind of looking to get into crypto because he's seen some DeFi protocols with 20 employees doing more loan volume than his current company that has 20,000 employees.
This episode is brought to you by Circle, the issuer of USDC, which hopefully, as you all know, is the preferred stablecoin of digital natives and crypto natives with over 1.5 million holders globally. You'll hear more about USDC later in the show.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Empire. We have two very special guests here that are going to probably have the best pulse into the industry in terms of recruiting and talent. So we have the privilege of having Aurora and Zack. Aurora has been involved extensively in Silicon Valley. She was involved in the early days of Coinbase and helping scale that team, and then at Polychain, where we actually first interacted in the last bear market. And so here we are in another bear market, but she is advising a bunch of companies, has a really good pulse on HR and landscape in crypto and Silicon Valley and tech in general. And then we also have Zack, who heads talent both internally and for portfolio companies at Dragonfly, one of the leading venture firms in crypto, which is focused on bridging East and West. And I had the privilege of interacting with Dragonfly primarily at my time in Parify. So Aurora, Zack, welcome to the pod.
Thanks. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Great to hear.
That's great. So before we get into it, maybe just give us a quick background on yourselves, and maybe that will set the stage for the discussion. So Aurora, feel free to go first.
So I've been in recruiting and HR for about my entire career, and I think I was initially attracted into the startup world when I joined Airbnb when they were pretty small, and realized that was a much better place for me. And I just loved the creativity and being able to be entrepreneurial, and was there for a couple of years and actually met Brian Armstrong. We became friends because he was the engineer who would always answer all my deeply technical questions so I could better talk to engineers when I was recruiting them. And he ended up a couple of years later with Barry Kwok, who's a mentor of mine also who worked at Airbnb. They told me about Coinbase, and I had no idea what it was, but he sent me the Bitcoin white paper and I read it, and I think my imagination just started running. And also I wanted to work with Brian again because he was somebody I deeply trusted, and I met the rest of the small team they had, and I felt like it was an opportunity that was too good to pass up. So I would guess that the thing that got me into the space really was just interest in what the potential was of Bitcoin at the time, and also wanting to work with people that I thought were really smart and inspiring and that I trusted.
Zack?
Thank you. I think you hit on some of the key points, but I tend to talk about this for some reason in reverse chronological order. So I'm at Dragonfly now. I joined here around the end of May last year. And my role has been overseeing the internal hiring that's happening here and working pretty closely with about 120, 130 companies in our portfolio on all stuff around recruiting and people. Before this, I worked at a company called 0x, which is also in the space. I joined there around the end of 2017. At the time they did their token sale, and was their first recruiter and head of talent, and kind of helped them grow over the course of 3 years. Before that, I did something similar at an analytics startup called Heap, which came out of Y Combinator. I joined pretty shortly after their Series A and their first recruiter. And I feel like in a prior life at this point, I was doing a bunch of eng hiring at Dropbox a few years before they went public, and at Google probably when they were about 50,000 people. I want to say they're 200, 250, something like that now. So kind of moving orders of magnitude smaller companies throughout my career, and somewhat intentionally. And I would say I've been interested in crypto since about 2015-ish, working in it since end of 2017 or so. And it's been fun. I think it'd be really hard for me to go back to a different industry at this point. It's different, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about today.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point. And I think a lot of times the narrative is a lot of the smartest people are increasingly coming to crypto. From your perspective, I'd like to get your opinion on that. Is that true? Are you seeing a slowdown given kind of the cyclicality of the space, the risks in the space, the uncertainty from a regulatory standpoint? Really curious to get your thoughts on this point.
So I think that there's a lot of really smart people everywhere, right? You have a lot of smart people in small companies and some of the bigger, more established companies. I think a lot of it has to do with Smart people want to have opportunity to be creative, have an impact, and have some the ability to influence the direction of the product. So yeah, I mean, I think you'd probably see a flow of some of the most intelligent people drafting towards any entrepreneurial technology, whether it's Web3 or whether it's VR or name your innovative technology that's coming about. And so I do think that with Web3 specifically, it's kind of an open greenfield frontier, which is really fun for a lot of technical people, a lot of creative people. And so I believe that's why you're seeing a big shift of people coming into the space. But yeah, I definitely think a lot of it has to do with life stage as well. And that, from what I've seen, people that are younger and younger and younger are getting into the space. Like I've hired people that are in high school more times than I can actually count, which is amazing, right? And I think that's kind of an indication of the trend of this is a completely new paradigm of how we do things. And the Web3 space kind of breaks the traditional mold of what's been done in the past. And it's very attractive to people that don't have a set paradigm of the way the world works. And so that's why you're getting people that are literally 14 years old that are brilliant, that want to come and work in the space. And I think that's really exciting. And I think that's probably the direction where the world is going.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what Aurora said. I think people who are attracted to highly creative opportunities, people who tend to be drawn towards some of the more bleeding edge kind of tech or things, greenfield opportunities to kind of play around with. There's something about the ethos of the space that I think really attracts builders, people who are passionate about building. I don't think there's been a trend away from that. If anything, just anecdotally, I feel like when I was starting to do recruiting in crypto in the end of 2017 or something, I don't want to say it was a small miracle, but it seemed uncommon to be hiring people from places like Google and Facebook and things like that. Although it happened, and we were coming off a bull run and kind of entering a bust cycle at that point, not unlike the one that we're in now. But nowadays, I find myself chatting very, very regularly with people from nearly all of the notable big tech companies, from the IC level through executive levels who are trying to get into the space. I think even in the downturns. And part of it too might be, I think the metrics are becoming a little bit more clear. Like I recently spoke with someone who works at a lending company in the traditional tech space, who's kind of looking to get into crypto because he's seen some DeFi protocols with 20 employees doing more loan volume than his current company that has 20,000 employees. And I think that comparison probably holds up with different primitives too, like decentralized exchange protocols versus centralized exchanges. I think it's just becoming clearer, kind of the power of decentralization over time. The tech is maturing a little bit, and it's kind of transitioning from this pie in the sky conjecture to real, scalable, kind of highly efficient use cases. And so, yeah, if anything, I think the trend is increasing in terms of people coming from traditional tech into the space. And for me, I've kind of always appreciated these downturns in terms of hiring, because I feel like it's a little less touristy, to be honest with you. Like the people who join now are the ones who tend to be really passionate about what we're doing, about the mission and the ethos, and they often end up becoming some of the most productive builders. So it's a cool time to be in the space doing hiring.
Definitely. That's such a good point. We've certainly seen a slowdown in tech and also in crypto. A lot of the criticisms have historically there have been a lot of kind of opportunists that come into the space. How much of that is true? And I'm curious the reasons why people in large companies like Google, Facebook's kind of the world are still hesitant to join this industry.
So yes, I will say that is absolutely something I've noticed, and I've been in the space since January of 2014. This has happened, about 3-4 times at this point. And you have these crypto winters, as we call them, where, the rest of the world kind of thinks that it's crazy and really dangerous and scary, and they go away. And the tourists, as you say, I think is a great way to describe them, because I actually prefer when they're not, obviously it's great when there's, the market is really doing well, but you get a lot of noise and people that are, I think, attracted to the space for honestly money, right? There's a lot of capital to be made in the space, and I think that attracts a lot of the wrong type of people that aren't interested in the technology. And I would say, to answer your question directly, like that's been the biggest shift, is the people that are really excited about the potential of what can be built in Web3 and what can change. And if they actually take the time to read more about it and learn about the the creative possibilities, that usually, in my opinion, gets them over the hump of being scared of the space. Because if you watch the news, right, and if you watch the numbers go up and down and up and down, sure, it can seem very volatile and very scary for somebody who doesn't have a deeper lens. But it doesn't at this point. I mean, there's so much knowledge, there's so many podcasts, there's so much reading about why there's more potential in the space. So frankly, it's a lot easier to get smart on the space and understand the true potential, at least in my opinion, compared to 2014. So I think that's probably why you're getting more and more people that are genuinely being interested in the space. But I guess, honestly, I think that it's a positive thing because it clears out the noise and the people that are going to join companies for a short period of time and then bounce because things get tough for maybe a year or two. And it gives companies a chance to regroup and build their infrastructure that broke when there was a last run. And there's a lot of positives that get the industry settled for the next time that essentially the price goes up and everybody starts paying attention to the industry again.
No, I agree with that. And I think you had asked Santi, like, why are people maybe hesitant? I would imagine it might be a few things, but for one, I feel like the space in terms of the size of teams, size of companies relative to other industries, it's still pretty nascent. And I feel like on average, the teams are far smaller. So part of it might just be personal working style. Like if you're used to working at a company that's 100,000, 200,000 people, there are not very many, if any of those in crypto at all. So there's a little bit of a mentality shift, maybe a different level of kind of ownership or autonomy that's often required to join a company that might be typical of one that's in this industry. But I think another thing that might play into this is I feel like there's a little bit of an education gap, very similar to what Aurora was saying. Like education is pretty critical here. And I feel like there's almost a polarization of interest, I would say. Like for people who are, I've kind of noticed, genuinely very into the space and have kind of taken up a passion for it or have their own deep interest in it. I've often found that it's 2-3 times easier to get people excited about what's going on than it might be if you were in kind of a more traditional tech environment. Whereas people who are still learning or who don't have that depth of background, it's probably 2 to 3 times as much education that's required to teach them kind of like the fundamentals of the space before you can even begin to get them excited about the prospects of like a specific project or company or something like that. So part of it might just be workflow and style. Part of it is probably just the learning curve. And I think some folks see that as intimidating if they're not used to it. But in my experience, immersion is kind of the best way to get exposure to that stuff. And there are many, many, many teams who are really excited about bringing on people that have a strong fundamental skill set and just genuine curiosity. And I think there are lots who are willing to kind of show the ropes to that type, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Speaking about certain trends and the type of people that are kind of more marketable and coveted, like from your portfolio standpoint, a lot of times people think that the space heavily skews towards engineering and engineers. They're really hard to come by. I want to touch on this point, and let's start with how much of that is true. If from your portfolio companies, Zach, perhaps what percentage are purely looking for engineers, and where are they finding them versus other roles? And if you're seeing trends around other type of roles that are increasingly more in demand versus kind of a couple of years ago.
Yeah, for sure. Eng is a thing, and it's always going to be a thing. I feel like any early team of builders is usually at least I don't know if I should say predominantly Eng, but notably engineering. But with that said, I think that's a misconception in terms of opportunities that are available. Really, almost any role you can think of outside of crypto at this point, I feel like is being hired for within crypto. And if you even go and check out like our portfolio jobs board at Dragonfly, for example, I think there are about 145 companies on there, close to 1,000 jobs. and it spans, literally everything from accounting to administration, data science, product design, legal, marketing, operations, sales, business development. So really, there's opportunity for just about anyone in the space at this point across a wide variety of fields. I think there's something to be said for deep specialization in the space. That might be another topic, like people who are quote unquote like crypto native or really have a deep fundamental understanding and kind of strong track record in the space. There's some nuance there, but there's an enormous amount of opportunity for anyone who I think is genuinely passionate or curious about it. I don't know if you'd agree, Aurora, but that's been my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, essentially, companies need more traditional functions to build, right? And so that's exactly what you're talking about. And I think there's a lot of emphasis on how different Web3 is from Web2, but there's a lot of similarities as well. You still need all the operations to run a company, even if you're distributed all over the world. I think that you probably find more opportunities across the board when we're in a bull market and things are growing, obviously. I think in a slower market like we're in right now, some of the higher priority roles that I have still seen companies hiring for is, to your point, always engineering. It's never going to stop. Engineering recruiters, also very hard to find, very important. You have to go find the engineers. But also communications, which is communications and marketing, like growth marketing, which to me has been super fascinating because when I first joined Coinbase, for example, we spent many years, like I would say a good 3 years, thinking, do we need marketing? Is now the right time for it? And we ultimately decided over and over again, it wasn't really, because it wasn't going to add a tremendous amount of value at the time. But now I think it's just an indication of the maturity of the space, or also the receptivity of the outside world to the space, where you do need more of these traditional marketers that have the ability to communicate what are you doing to the outside world. And I think the NFT space is just a very great example where you're finding a lot of people that are coming with more traditional communications backgrounds that are getting into the space, so that your average person can have a better understanding of what this is all about, which has been really exciting for me because most of the products have been extremely technical and very deep, which makes a lot of sense given that we've been building these layers up until now. But now we're kind of at this point where you have this application layer that's being built that your average person can relate to, and it's use cases that normal people can understand, which is incredibly exciting for me because I'm not a technical person, and I love recruiting software engineers because I find the way they think really fascinating. But I also think that the ability to start getting the rest of the world to understand it is so crucial. So seeing this uptick of marketing and communications people that are coming into the space has been really exciting for me.
Yeah,
I agree with that, and I feel like honestly, I think there are some nuances to hiring within crypto or Web3 versus hiring in more traditional tech companies. But my honest opinion is there are a ton of parallels to hiring in any company outside of the space. Like they're happy to talk about what I think some of the differences are, but a lot of the teams that I work with are very much 0 to 1, like making their first 20 hires. And there's not a standard order of operations for doing that. But I feel like it's not uncommon in the first 20 hires to see a good handful of engineers, a designer, maybe somebody handling business development, product management, recruiting, community management, legal, potentially finance, potentially customer support. So like Aurora was saying, all of the same functions that you would expect from in a more standard kind of traditional tech company. It is very much the same, I think, in crypto, although there's some unique nuance to hiring effectively in the space, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Maybe touch on that. Sorry, Aurora, you were going to say?
That's exactly what I was going to do, is kind of add a little more context to that.
Yeah,
in that
please do.
you have these more, these structured roles that you also see in different organizations, but you really can't, and probably, especially if you're a small company, you shouldn't go find somebody who has done this for 10 years at some big organization, because they're unlikely to be successful because they can't scale down to a size that small. They're not used to running with a team of one, right? And so that's something that I emphasize with startups a lot, is you may need these skills, but you really want to prioritize for scrappiness, humility, flexibility, the ability to run with things, and again, I'll kind of emphasize the humility aspect, right? Because you can come with the traditional skill set that you might need to run any number of these things that Zach just touched on, but you also need to understand that you are still a 20-person company, and you have to be asked to do 5 other things that may not necessarily be part of your skill set, but you have to have a great attitude and be excited about that. And finding those people that have that traditional skill set so they can add value on that front, but also are excited about the prospect of just being part of a team that can, and jumping in wherever they're needed, is, I think, a crucial element when you're hiring these people. And it's interesting because I have seen companies that do optimize for, we're going to go hire the, not going to pick on any one company, we're going to go hire the executive or the really experienced person who's done this for 10 years at name your big thing. And they struggle. We did this honestly at Coinbase, where we brought in people that just couldn't get into the weeds enough. And so I think it's a really big lesson of, yes, go find the skill set, but make sure you also find that other flexible aspect as well. And you're looking for these people.
Yeah.
Zach, I'm sure you have a ton of thoughts on this as well, because you're doing this all the time with Dragonfly.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I feel like that's probably true of startups outside of crypto too. To be honest with you,
Mm-hmm.
Anytime you're at a company that's at a certain stage, I think it's beneficial to bring in people who have a mindset that works well for that particular stage. And just because this space is still quite nascent, and again, on average, I may have a little bit of a skewed perspective in that we mostly do early stage investments, but on average, the teams are quite small. I think you're right. Like finding people who have humility, who have pretty high degree of initiative, like a high degree of creative freedom, are able to operate, relatively autonomously, or at least ask questions and loop help in when they need to. That's been pivotal for a lot of the teams that we're working with. So yeah, I do feel like there's unique nuance to hiring within crypto, but the more time I spend in the space, the more parallels I see, honestly, I think, to even traditional tech companies as well.
I want to get your opinion on two things. One, Anon culture, like hiring pseudo-anonymous or anonymous people, and what your thoughts are on that. And let's maybe just start there.
Yeah, I mean, as I was just saying, I think there's some unique aspects to hiring in the space, and part of that, in my opinion, is there are entirely new hiring structures that are coming out of this industry that we've never seen before, like DAO hiring, for example. Like how decentralized autonomous organizations, which are a relatively new thing, are doing hiring, and that can get weird depending on how the DAO is structured. In many cases, they might have a centralized entity that's kind of just hiring like a normal team or company would, and that entity kind of simply contributes to the DAO, which then collectively makes governance decisions on what happens overall with its resources. But if it's a full-blown decentralized hiring thing, like hiring even is fully handled by the DAO, that's a whole different game. Like if the DAO is kind of deciding who to hire or what to pay, maybe even it gets to a point where they're doing like community-driven performance reviews and compensation adjustments and things like that. I don't think we're really seeing a lot of that yet, but it's a thing, and people are thinking about it. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see more and more of it in the years ahead. And to your point about anonymous or pseudo-anonymous hiring, that's a hard one. Like some of the challenges there are, if you're in the US, for example, how do you verify that they're not from sanctioned countries if you don't really know who these people are? Or can you trust them not to run off with trade secrets? And these are questions that have potentially massive implications. And again, they're all doable, but this stuff is very much still unfolding, and I think it requires a certain degree of rigor in understanding. Like this is stuff that we think a lot about on the VC side, I think, in trying to provide support to these teams. But that's where it starts to become a new ballgame, I think, in a big way with crypto.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on like DAO and DAOs in particular, and this idea of hierarchy? A lot of times DAOs like to say, "Oh, like we're flattening the structure," and a lot. I'm curious to get your thoughts on the future, more generally, like future work. Obviously, with COVID, I think people realize, hey, we can work remotely. What can we expect, or what are you seeing from companies being kind of like, just curious of your thoughts generally on the future of work and hierarchy and DAOs in particular?
I mean, it's pretty. This is a really new space, right? And I think that if I look at how I think things might play out with DAOs in the future, if I look at more of like a centralized organization, what are the things that the hierarchy really provides? And I think it's communicate. In my perspective, it's communication, prioritization, holding people accountable, right? Making sure that there is just free flow of information so people understand what they're all working towards. And this is, I guess we're sort of like in the middle stage where you have all of these companies that are decentralized and working all over the world. And so I guess my answer to you is building in structure, I think, is crucial when you have these decentralized organizations where you don't have like single points of people who are responsible for communicating mission, the priorities, as well as holding people accountable. And so I think it becomes absolutely crucial to have consistent structure that's built from the very beginning of how decisions will be communicated out, how communications will be decided on, how you will make sure that certain projects come to fruition, right? And I'll be honest, I don't actually have a great answer on this one, just because I think similar to token comp, we're kind of figuring out how this works as we go, right? If you had asked me 2 years ago where I thought token comp was going to go, I would have no idea, frankly. But now I think I have a better idea because we've kind of all been frankly bumbling through it and seeing what works, what doesn't, and coming up with models that we think are helpful. And I think as I give advice to companies, my own advice is changing pretty frequently, which is normal, I think, in this space, because I may have a certain idea of how I think things should work, and then it's broken, and I have to find another solution on how to help guide those people. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for you, but I think that we'll figure it out.
Yeah, I feel like comp would be something really interesting to discuss in more detail too. That's
yeah, I do want to go to that next. Yeah. Definitely.
Another thing that's definitely got some nuance as far as it comes to crypto. But to your question about hierarchy and that kind of a thing, the first thing that comes to mind for me is, at least from a company perspective, I don't know, when I think of DAOs and kind of future of work and a lot of the ideas that are associated with that, personally, I go to this mental model of, I don't want to say freelancing, but everybody is kind of more autonomous in their work, or there's an idea that maybe people will work for multiple DAOs, and I guess from a company perspective, the one thing that I often hear in conversations about this is the benefit of having someone kind of embedded fully in their project versus maybe being more of this freelance type that might work with many projects across the industry or different industries. And trying to draw an analogy to like my own work, having been at Dragonfly for about 1.5 years, I feel like I've picked up a lot of really unique context that's specific to our portfolio, where I could go freelance probably and do this for many other companies, but I wouldn't have that same level of knowledge or expertise as I do spending my time full-time here on this one kind of project. So I think companies are thinking about that a lot in the context of DAOs too. Like, what's the benefit of having somebody working on our project full-time versus having them distributed across many projects? And that, again, can be like a much deeper understanding of their specific structures. And it can also be deeper relationships with other people on the team, maybe an easier ability to kind of leverage colleagues or other people in their own projects and in their own work. So yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how it all unfolds as DAOs kind of proliferate over the years ahead, and even tools that help orchestrate DAOs and pull together workflows improve, which I think has been happening, if that makes sense.
All right, everyone, time for a quick word from Circle and USDC. As a crypto user, you know the power of stablecoins, dollar digital currencies that transcend borders, banking hours, and legacy financial rails. Well, Circle's USDC has quickly become one of the most trusted and widely used stablecoins. It's simple. People use USDC because of its composability, its stability, and its reserve transparency. And USDC isn't just adopted by a few of us DeFi degens and DAOs and NFT marketplaces, crypto companies alike, they all leverage USDC to diversify their treasury, asset management, and ecosystem-wide composability. The adoption's clear. USDC has grown to more than $50 billion in circulation since launching in 2018. We all have and we all will continue to take shots on our favorite volatile crypto assets, obviously, but USDC is one of the easiest ways to store your funds in a stable asset that can be used to send value around the world almost instantly. It lowers the cost of cross-border payments. It integrates into the growing ecosystem of crypto apps. As a seamless, trusted dollar digital currency, USDC is a 0-to-1 opportunity for the financial system. If you want to learn more about USDC, I would recommend you check out their recently published Transparency Hub on Circle.com. It's a great update to Circle's content on USDC. It outlines everything from links to their weekly reserve reports, monthly attestations, blog posts that are written by their exec team that highlight how and why USDC was built the way it is. Really recommend it. Just go to circle.com/transparency to access it. Now, let's get back to the show.
Yeah, no, definitely. Let's turn to compensation. It's a big topic. Maybe just what have you learned over the last years? Aurora, you mentioned there's a constant evolution in this topic. So maybe just let's start there and then discuss this in detail.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really been eye-opening because the market has shifted. And I think that's exposed a lot of vulnerabilities in how people had been talking about compensation over the past year. And I think a year and a half ago, people were kind of, for better or for worse, equating compensation to equity, which I think is a big mistake, right? Because they've been sort of replacing the equity component that you might have in a company with tokens, which does make sense given the nature of the space and that it is a decentralized space, right? But there are very different tax implications on how tokens are treated versus equity. And I think it's really important when companies are deciding if they want to issue token packages to understand, work very closely with their legal team on what are the ramifications for employees. Because coming from a recruiting lens or just a people lens, period, this is not something that anybody has really done before. And so I think employees are kind of looking for companies to guide them on what this actually means, right? Because for better or for worse, if the market takes a dip, the companies do get blamed for it. And that's what I'm seeing now is you had these packages that were issued at the top of the market when, a token may be worth like $25. And then it shifts, it drops, and now the token is worth $2. And so you have all these different challenges around my packages disappeared. Maybe it was pitched as a bonus, which is the wrong expectation setting, right? I understand why companies pitch it as a bonus, but I think a lot of employees have certain mental models around what a bonus means. And you've had this shift of people were talking about packages in terms of dollar amount. And I think that's also a mistake, right? Because you can't control the dollar amount. And I think if I were to give companies advice at this point, I would definitely say, you want to think about this in terms of just token packages and number of tokens, and then you tell a story. It really becomes about what the narrative is around what those tokens will be worth in different scenarios. Right now, we're in a downturn. And so the tokens are going to be worth X because of X, Y, and Z, right? But we're building these different products and we're working towards a common goal. And we have, we believe that the token and the network will be worth X if we were to launch and execute on these different goals, right? And I think what it really comes down to is selling people on the long-term vision of what we're trying to build here. If we had the flexibility or the visibility into our equity price with Coinbase during the last, many, many years, I think there would be a lot of tumultuousness, right? But when I was early Coinbase, you didn't know because it was just an equity package. It was a 409A. And there was a preferred value, and that was kind of all you had. It wasn't changing day to day. And so I do think that companies really need to go back to who are they hiring and how are they selling the vision and finding people that are genuinely bought into the long-term vision rather than the tourists, as we talked about before, that are really just interested in chasing the dollar because it's a very volatile market.
Yeah, Zach, before I go to you, or two things I want to ask you. One, what are some of the red flags? And how do you qualify a candidate? Like for a founder out there who's saying, hey, I don't really know, how can you tell if he's a quote unquote a tourist?
Well, people will always tell you that they're not. They'll always tell you that they're excited about the long-term potential of the space. But usually if you dig a few layers deeper and you just kind of follow a thread, it unravels pretty quickly, right? And so if you're, asking about like how long have you been following this space? Like why are you interested in this space? And if it's something that's popped up just in the last, couple of months and they have a bunch of friends that are talking about it, I would say that could be the beginning of something deeper, right? But how much initiative have they taken to really go down the rabbit hole since then? Are they pulling in different examples of why they think this could, change the world? Are they pulling in reasons why this is more meaningful to them? So I think that's one of the things is just I'll follow the thread and see how quickly it unravels. But another thing too are people that are really pushing hard on the comp piece, right? I think compensation is important, right? We all need a certain amount of money to live, but there is an excitement level of being willing to optimize for tokens or equity or, being willing to just have flexibility when it comes to that. That to me is a positive signal, right? And when people are very, very rigid on that and they have certain hard cash amounts that they aren't willing to adjust on, that's a red flag. Because if somebody is only interested in cash, then when the market flips, they're the first ones to leave.
Yeah, I agree. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like I should be careful using the word tourist too, just because I feel like everyone starts out as a tourist, and I think there's room for tourists in the space for what it's worth too. But there are also, and so I don't know, the more I think about it, that word, there's truth to it. And I said it for a reason when I first said it, but I don't want that to seem unwelcoming to anybody who might see this that is interested in the space and kind of wants to get into it. And I also think that anytime you're doing recruiting, the onus is kind of on you to educate and highlight, why this space makes sense. So I just want to encourage people who might be interested, even if they are still getting into the space, to still think about it, to still pursue it. There's plenty of opportunity.
It's okay to have growing conviction over time.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. Totally. But to Aurora's point, like there's something to be said for a certain level of conviction or passion or curiosity or initiative in terms of diving into this stuff on your own. And I think that curiosity just kind of naturally comes through as you talk to someone in terms of the questions they ask, or maybe even how they think about the kind of the fundamentals of the space. And the point about comp, I generally agree. I think there are some people who came into the space or are trying to come into the space because they see a potential outsized upside opportunity. And I think that's true. But I've also kind of found that even, very sexy, successful projects are still having trouble finding talent. And it's more about a lack of supply. I think it's because regular tech obviously has much deeper pockets than anything in crypto, but supply and demand are more balanced. Like people have had kind of decades to understand the tech. So comp, I think, gets particularly fierce when you're looking at like crypto native talent or talent that's kind of been in the space, really has a deep understanding of it, maybe has some expertise around smart contract development or some other kind of niche thing within the industry, because demand kind of far outweighs supply. So these specialists, like protocol researchers or engineers, have an incredible amount of opportunity available to them. And a fair amount of them are in pretty nascent but promising niches, and again, can offer a lot of upside. And beyond kind of the amount of money that's flowing to candidates being very high, there's also a lot of greenfield opportunity with how quickly the space is growing and moving. And that means there's a huge opportunity cost for these folks who have this expertise that are looking to join different companies. I think lots of folks are even interested in kind of potentially founding their own things to tackle these problems and, reap higher ownership or higher rewards or whatever, higher creative freedom, whatever it might be. And I'll come back to the comp piece in a second, but interestingly, I think that doesn't only mean that it may be more difficult to hire this type of talent up front. I think it also means it can be harder to retain talent in this space as they develop deeper competence in the industry, because again, the demand is just so high and they have like an enormous amount of opportunity that kind of opens up to them. But as far as comp, I mean, there's some stuff that's really special and unique to crypto. The big one being token-based comp, and I have a lot of thoughts on token-based comp. But beyond that, yeah, I think it's just that, for highly specialized roles, you can see comp kind of be all over the board and very, very outsized. In terms of tokens specifically, I think a lot of people might not be privy to like some of the benefits of it as well. And to Aurora's point, it is actually very different than equity. Like there's instant liquidity, faster time to market, like, no need to wait for a company to kind of go public or get acquired. There's often no exercise cost, like options when you have tokens. I think it's arguable that the rewards are kind of more directly tied to the company's product or community, rather than just being like a subject of kind of the capital structure of the business. You have access to lending markets where you can kind of tap underlying liquidity. There's all sorts of stuff you can do, like staking and lending and yield generation with tokens. And interestingly, I think it's significantly for companies, there's often no dilution for tokens, at least if you have a fixed supply of tokens.
Exactly.
And from a company perspective, this leads to some really interesting challenges in terms of figuring out the right amount of tokens to give somebody, or how do you calculate the right amount of tokens. And I think Aurora was touching on this a bit, but different than equity in that, for a traditionally funded startup, your valuation might be pegged to your more recent 409A, unless you're like just coming off of a raise. Whereas with tokens, this is kind of constantly dynamic and constantly moving. So if you're trying to calculate the amount of tokens that you want to give to somebody based on the dollar value, especially in such a volatile market, you may have somebody who joins when your token is $1, and a month later it's $1.40, and they have the same level of experience and they're doing the same kind of job. But just by nature of where the market is, people can end up with like wildly disparate comp packages over time. So like Aurora was saying, I think educating people on this and making sure that you're kind of taking an informed approach to how you calculate these offers is really important. And there are various methods to doing it, all of which I think have pros and cons. I've written a little bit about this, some blog posts and stuff, but yeah, token comp is kind of a whole different world. And I think when candidates learn about the benefits of it, they often naturally get very excited, but it can be a draw for, I don't want to say the wrong reasons, but like Aurora was saying, it can be a primary decision-making factor for some people, if that makes sense.
How distracting is it for candidates? Or like once you hire someone, you have a real-time ticker on super early stage companies. Historically in, Web2 land, it takes up to a decade or so for a company like Coinbase, Uber, Lyft to go public. And there's something comforting around that. Aurora, you mentioned this earlier in the Coinbase example. How distracting is this for candidates? And I think it is distracting. So let's just assume that's the case. It's always lurking in the back of your mind, whether one day you're a millionaire and another day you're not a millionaire. And so what are some of the design structures that you've resorted to kind of combat this issue, if you will? Zach, you kind of alluded to this just now.
Yeah. I think the first thing is just consistent education, like from day one, kind of informing people that this is kind of the nature of the industry in a big way. Like we're talking about essentially like a brand new asset class, all sorts of new financial instruments. And it's not super common that people have an opportunity to see the development of that type of market. So I think from the time that you're kind of introducing the space to them or telling them about your company, encouraging them to understand the historical trends in the space is useful. And with founders that I've worked with, I often try and drive at the importance of maintaining that education, even during bull markets. Like you should still be telling people kind of this is what we expect. This is how things might go. Like it's a great time to be here now, but education is a critical part of that. I think
like how much of it should be upfront, how much of it should be at the discretion, milestone based, how easy is it to embed certain milestones, trusting the core team to honor certain promises? How do you set a bonus? How much of it is that a practice? I'm just kind of thinking of my days in investment banking, and that like I've worked in different fields and they're all kind of different. A lot of it is maybe tied to bonuses, but setting a bonus is tricky and can piss people off. And so I'm kind of curious how you think about all of that.
Yeah, I think there are trade-offs to all these different approaches. And in my opinion, fairness and consistency are something that you should be taking into consideration too. Like, you can do this any which way and there will be benefits and detriments. But I think picking something that works well, understanding why it works well for you, and being consistent and transparent about how and why you're doing it is has a big impact on how your team might feel about how you're doing things, if that makes sense. So I wouldn't say it's not sensible to set milestone-based, comp targets or something. But to your point, some people might not like that versus, kind of the more guaranteed cash flow or liquidity that they would get in a more traditional structure.
Aurora, you were going to say?
Yeah, I would really plus one what Zach said on that. Just, every different cultures are going to want to do different things. And so, some of them may do incentive bonuses. Some of them may get creative with the vesting schedules, right? To incentivize long-term retention. And then to Zach's initial point, just tons and tons of education around, why they're offering what they're offering and how that's consistent with the way the company does something, right? But I really, really echo the consistency piece of being fair across the board with all of the employees, because you can just assume that employees will talk about their comp in general, and making sure that you've hard coded fairness into how things work is really crucial.
Would you put comp in a smart contract, which is audible and observable to everyone? Do you think that's viable and a smart thing to do? Or would you advise founders to not kind of embed this in a smart contract and be kind of open to everyone to observe?
Yeah, not only is it viable, I mean, it's happening. Like there are companies.
People see a wallets, right, of core team, and like they're like, okay, well, they distributed X amount to someone, and it's fairly easy to identify, right?
Yeah, and I think that's one other unique thing about being in this space is the space in general is very highly open source and transparent. And I don't even just mean from an engineering perspective, but in my opinion, another reason why kind of consistency and transparency and doing things from an ethical kind of first principles perspective is so important, because you're right. These things are not impossible to discover. If you can figure out a team's multi-sig, it's not that hard to figure out where tokens are going. And
yeah, my interaction, there's a really interesting like Coordinate, for instance, that came out of Yearn, that they've like embedded a lot of, one of the core devs there was very much an HR theory and kind of openness and radical transparency, if you will, kind of like Bridgewater. What are your thoughts on that? Like, this idea that everyone should kind of freely understand and know, and maybe even like upvote and distribute, if there's a common pool of a co-op, if you will, like people should have the ability to, on a merit-based ongoing basis, which is subject to like every quarter, the team kind of votes, hey, Zach, this quarter you really contributed to the code base and you deserve 40% of like the revenue or whatever. Next quarter, if you didn't do, such a good job, you may get like the bare minimum of 5%. Like, do you think that type of structure works? Is it too complicated, uncertain for candidates? Or is there potentially a scenario where these type of more like on the frontier compensation structures and hierarchy structures potentially could work in this context?
Are you asking like across one specific team, whether it makes sense to kind of empower the whole team to have input on like one person's comp and be transparent with the whole org about what that comp looks like, kind of a thing?
Yeah. If you're familiar with these type of structures, I would curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think this is what I was alluding to a little bit earlier when I was talking about like some of these new models, like DAOs, maybe where in the future, it could even be people that are outside of the company that are maybe token holders who are kind of like reviewing the performance of people who are DAO participants and actually having an impact on how these folks get paid or reviewing their performance period. It's a hard one. That's a big philosophical question that I probably want to spend a little more time kind of thinking about. I think you have to be thinking about fairness, and you have to be thinking about how well the people who have input are really able to evaluate. Like, do they have the right skill set to fairly kind of make those decisions and impact somebody's livelihood in that way?
Yeah. I definitely, yeah, I think that, Zach brings up a very good point in that people, while you can have a community of people that are all inputting, what somebody's comp should be, there are so many other factors that make us human that can affect how somebody might view if somebody is deserving of, an increase in compensation, right? There's insecurities, there's lack of knowledge, there's a number of different criteria. But also, I think another piece is it measurable, right? There are certain roles where your output will be very easy to measure. And I'm oversimplifying this, right? But you can see if, a certain amount of code that's put into a code base is effective. You can see it's just easier to measure that type of thing. Whereas coming from like a non-technical background, there's a lot of things that are much harder to measure. For example, HR, right? How the heck do you measure HR? Is it important to running a company? 100%, because humans are humans and they need to communicate and they have emotions and they have, like I said, insecurities that have to be sort of attended to and managed. And so it can be just as important to have somebody in that role, but how do you measure that? And how do you have a community vote on if that person is doing a good job or not? So I think, I love the idea. I think philosophically having complete transparency addresses things like inequality, right? Which I think is fantastic. But trying to figure out how do you build that in, and what are the measurements that you use as you're putting it into the smart contract to decide how the system works is pretty complicated.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I guess the last quick point on that too is like, if you think about having complete transparency around compensation, I think there also has to be complete contextual transparency, like transparency around goals, transparency around all the different evaluative points that might play into someone's performance adjustments, and whether or not it's to the competitive benefit of the company to have all of that public is another philosophical kind of quandary, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What are your thoughts on references? I've heard some folks say, hey, sometimes a particular candidate references extremely poorly, or like is really smart folks sometimes tend to be bipolar in the way that references kind of come out. I'm curious if you found that to be true, and your thoughts generally on doing references, how much weight you should be placing. If, for instance, you get a terrible reference, how much, like, instances where you've like overlooked that and, even hired the candidate after getting a terrible reference?
This is a fun question. I feel like this is always kind of a controversial one, depending on who I'm talking to. I won't hire.
Yeah, like I feel like if you reference Adam Newman, like a lot, you're going to get like all kinds of answers. Yet here he is again, raising again and again. So anyways.
Right. And the reality is, I think there's a lot of people in the space that can be a little bit extreme in terms of their personalities. They're brilliant and they're going to make something big happen, but they're not exactly fun to work with. But I wouldn't personally hire, if I could avoid it, I would not personally hire anybody without thoroughly back channeling them. And I don't mean front door references, I mean back channels where I find people that have worked with them in the past. And I'm very careful never to threaten their current job, right? I find people that I trust who are willing to give me confidential information that have a very well thought out, applicable perspective on this person. I'm not going to go talk to somebody who worked with them tangentially at a company 5 years ago, right? That's not going to give me any signal. But I think that I don't make any decision based off of one reference too, right? You get as many as you can. And so if you get one that just tanks the candidate, you consider it in the context of what other people are saying and what you've observed with the candidate yourself. I've actually had a candidate, this is really funny. I interviewed somebody, I will just nameless person at one of the companies, and actually really didn't like them. I thought that they were really abrasive. I thought they were poor communicator, and I thought that they were just going to be very challenging for the whole team to work with, but they were brilliant technically. Sound familiar? Probably, like many people in the space. But the engineers that were basically work trialing this person were telling me, like, this is one of the best people that I've seen in a really long time. And so I thoroughly back channeled this person with people that had worked with him in the past. And I got so many positive results of people that said he knows his stuff. Also, when he's really excited, he really leans in, and he's quite collaborative when he's really excited about a project. And so we decided as a group, because he was prickly for sure, and he definitely rubbed some of the engineers the wrong way as well. But they ultimately couldn't get past the fact that he just was such an amazing thought partner and engineer. So we took a risk, hired him, and I'm so glad that we did, because he ended up being one of the top performers. But also, once he got comfortable in his own environment, some of the peculiarities about him of being in an environment of interviewing kind of disappeared, and it became sort of endearing almost. So I think that's a good example of, I think when it worked out referencing, because we were able to get enough signal to decide that it was worth taking the risk. But yeah, I'm a big fan, I guess, in some. I think it's very important to reference, and I would advise all founders to do that when they're hiring.
Yeah, I think I agree with Aurora, although I may not feel quite as strongly about it. It is, I do think it's really important, and I don't know, in my opinion, and I think this could be viewed as contentious. I feel like references that a candidate provides to you are at best partially effective in that they have the chance to kind of cherry pick the people who you contact. But with that said, there might be a case, and I have seen it happen, where you learn something illuminating. And I think it can be especially helpful when you're hiring someone like a manager or someone who has responsibilities, managing other people, because manager report relationships have a very interesting dynamic. But 100% echoing what Aurora was saying, I think infinitely more valuable are back channel references, kind of behind the scenes conversations with mutual connections that you trust. And that's honestly just the nature of the industry. Like it's just going to happen. I think, there are constantly reputational tidbits kind of being shared. And that kind of context can be super, super useful. And yeah, is common practice for sure. So I don't think, go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, Zach. I think Zach makes a really good point too, though. Like, I don't totally discount front door references, right? The ones that they give you, because sometimes that's all you can get, especially with junior candidates that don't have a big network. And to your point, they can provide a lot of value, especially when you're looking at like 360-degree references, which is, what he had mentioned. If you're hiring for a manager, you should try to find somebody who's worked for them that has an opinion on what it's like to work for that person. So I think, I probably came across as a little strong in that I won't hire without reference checking. And have I ever hired without back channel referencing? I have, because I've had to in some cases, right? And you kind of get the most signal you can, and then you take the leap. And if it works out, great. And if it doesn't, you've made a mistake, then you fix it as quickly as possible.
I think a tangentially related thing that I am often telling founders is like, to the immediate question about references, like, yes, I think they're worthwhile. And I think back channel references in particular can be especially worthwhile. But maybe more importantly, I think you should have confidence in your interview process, period. And it should be a major goal to have your process so well designed that you can hire without references if need be. That's not to say that you shouldn't do them, but I do think it's really, really worth it to be deliberate about what you're looking for and make sure that your interview process is kind of extracting all of the specific signal that you want, and it can offset some of the risk around references, period, whether or not they're worthwhile to run.
I guess more at this has been a fascinating discussion. I do want to get your thoughts. Both of you have been around the space for quite a bit of time. You mentioned that there are things that you have adapted to change quite a bit over the years. Crypto has seen a lot, and we've grown a lot as an industry, but we're still early, I think. What are some of the kind of recruiting tactics or skills or things that you placed maybe weight on that you've changed or adapted in a meaningful way over the years? Particularly perhaps things that you would have thought would place a lot of emphasis on historically, and now you've totally changed your mind on?
I feel like we were just talking about this, actually. I think there's a couple of these. I think the one that we were talking about earlier was actually, it's less of a recruiting, it's related to recruiting, but it's actually on if you're working in the office or not. I think I used to be a very big believer that you needed to be in the office, getting a lot of face time with people in order to develop relationships of trust and have better communication, build a strong culture. And I do think it helps a lot when you have that. But I also have been kind of forced to change my viewpoint on that since working in the space and since the pandemic hit specifically, and it kind of made it just easier for everybody to be completely distributed, and companies are going to do it whether you think it's a good idea or not. And they've been hiring all over the world in completely distributed form, and it's forced me to kind of think about how do I give companies advice to make sure that they can mitigate some of the downsides when you do have a completely distributed workforce, and what is basically the structure to ensure strong communication and clear prioritization of what is happening, and how can you do that. And there are actually many ways to do that. There's a lot of tools that are available to make sure that you have that communication. So I think that's a big one. And then I think another one is when I first started, it was in 2014, and there were no crypto native engineers really, right? It was too early in the space. There might have been, but most of the time it wasn't really a thing. I don't think that was really even a term back then. And so I definitely would try to find people that were building with technologies that you would use in the space. And I'd comb through GitHub to try to find people that had basically, were working with the technologies and the tech stack that our company was using. But I think as time has gone on, and as to what Zack was talking about before, you have a supply and demand issue, right? And I think there's so many talented people from Web2 that are coming in, and they have a great skill set. They have great rigor and experience they're bringing in from some of these other companies that are in Web2. And I think that those make some of the best engineers. And as long as they have the desire and the inclination to ramp, then you can bring them in. And I think obviously we recruited only those people in the early days of Coinbase because there weren't crypto native engineers. But I think even more and more, I've developed a conviction that smart, really motivated engineers can learn anything. And I don't necessarily think that it is as crucial. There's certain roles, right, where I think it is more important, like protocol designers, protocol engineers. But I think I'm now more comfortable kind of giving guidance to companies to go recruit from Web2 to find people that are going to come into their companies, because supply and demand. But also I think if you find the right people, they will figure it out. And then if you set them up with the right structure to onboard them, then you can still make sure they're going to be successful.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
No, I agree with all those points. And I think two things that have come to mind as I was just thinking about this now, things that I've learned to place more value on, or the value of these practices has become increasingly clear throughout my career doing recruiting, especially as I moved towards earlier and earlier stage companies. One, in my opinion, is the importance of values-driven hiring. So being very explicit about what you value as a company, and the things that you want to see in everyone who you hire, and kind of what your principles are to begin with, and incorporating that explicitly into your hiring process. I don't think every company does this or cares to do it, but I think there's a lot of benefit to it, especially in the early days or in periods of rapid growth. Like if you're going from 5 people to 50 people over the course of the year, making sure that you know what you really care about and that you're screening for those kind of principal level things can go a very long way in terms of maintaining and safeguarding your culture as it scales, because it's naturally going to shift a lot when you're growing at that rate and you're pulling in people from various backgrounds and kind of different cultures to begin with. I also think it's a really, really big attractant for candidates if you can very clearly say what you stand for and how you work, and they can kind of make a decision on whether or not they feel like there's alignment there. So I think the importance of values-driven hiring and seeing that as just as important as someone's technical skills is something that has become more important to me over my career. The second thing that kind of came to mind, and I'm sorry if you were going to ask something there, Santi, I'm happy to pause.
Yeah, I was going to say on this point that I want to get both of your kind of, how do you succinctly describe culture? Ben Horowitz has a good book, I think, touches on this, which is what you do. What you do is who you are, how to create your business culture. He has his own definition. I'm curious to get your thoughts on culture, which we talk about a lot in this industry, but how would you succinctly describe culture?
Do you have thoughts, Aurora? You want me to go?
I do, but I'll let you go first.
Sure. In my mind, I feel like it has a lot to do with your principles, kind of what you stand for, your workflows, like the way that you operate. those might be some of the main things. Kind of, I need to give that a little bit more thought for a second, but those are the two things that kind of come to mind. Like, what are the things that you want to see remain consistent throughout the course of the company's growth? What are the things that you're proud of that we've accomplished, or the types of things that you would feel proud of if we were able to accomplish? Are there specific traits that you feel like should be carried through in anyone who we hire? I think that has a big impact on the culture and environment of your team and what it is that you're building. What kinds of things do you celebrate? What kinds of things do you want to avoid? These are all kind of philosophical, culturally loaded questions in my mind. But yeah, the two words that immediately pop into mind are like principles and kind of workflows as just a quick answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with the framing that Zach did of principles and workflows as well, because I learned a lot about this during my time at Airbnb. I think Brian Chesney, the founders at Airbnb, are obsessed with culture in a great way, and I think they were very thoughtful around thinking through the values and actually incorporating a bunch of the employees as part of those to understand what do these mean to us and how do they define how we do business together. And I really liked that because I think I think people have a tendency to think of culture as, the people, which would make sense, right? But like, what is it about the people that makes it such a great place to work? And by kind of distilling it down into these specific values that govern, or at least that you look for, and when you're hiring, it helps you to understand, okay, you like this group of people, but why is it exactly that you really enjoy working with this group? What is it about this person or about these people? What are the characteristics that make you really want to work with them? And it gives you kind of a framework to understand how are you going to evaluate people that come in so that you can continue to build on that type of person, right? And what worked well at Airbnb, and then also we took that same philosophy and we did that at Coinbase, was to break it down into these values and then incorporate them in a very structured way into the hiring process. And so you decide, okay, as a company, what are your values or what are your principles, if you will? And then you come up with a very structured rubric on how do you interview to look for those specific qualities, and very consistent, right? Because I think there's a danger when you're talking about values and culture for unconscious bias to creep in. And you have to be very structured to avoid that, because otherwise people just hire people that are similar to themselves, right? But if you're very structured, I think that can help you avoid that trap. And by tying it into not just the way you hire, but also how you make decisions, right? Incorporating it into how you run your team meetings and how you decide if you're going to bring on a vendor, right? Like if one of your values is efficient execution, to talk about one of Coinbase's values, that's a really important way that everybody functions. And so finding people that are going to align with that works well. Or, be a host is one of Airbnb's, and it's very uniquely Airbnb, but finding people that, kind of are similar on that front and care about that as a way that they function. So I think it's very important to, be thoughtful about how you kind of define these principles of the way you do business, but also to, be very structured in how you're executing it.
Yeah.
I guess, well, I really enjoyed this discussion. I think it's an important time for, people to understand the opportunities that exist in crypto, especially during this downturn. The space is not going anywhere, increasingly so. I think it's continuing to attract really smart, talented individuals, in spite of all the risks, the uncertainty, the volatility. It's not hard. I mean, it's not easy to come into this space, but increasingly this asset class, this movement is capturing the imagination of an entire generation across multiple verticals. So really appreciate your perspective. I guess like parting thoughts, for anyone listening out there, builders, people that want to come to the space, what would be kind of your advice and just parting thoughts, and especially where people can find you, can learn more about Zach, you mentioned you have a blog. So yeah, where can people learn more about your current involvement and thinking in the space?
Yeah, for sure. Trying to think if there are any super salient parting thoughts. I want to say if this is something that's interesting to you, pursue it. There's probably more opportunity than you think. And I think that opportunity is ever growing. And if I can be helpful, happy to try. You can catch me on Twitter. My handle is ZORKARY, Zorkery, which is a weird name that an old boss gave me. It's kind of a strange twist on my first name. I don't have a personal blog at the moment, but I did write a couple of pieces that are on Dragonfly's research blog. So if you check out Dragonfly's website and click through to our Medium, you'll find them there. There are 2 on token comp specifically. But I guess parting thoughts, one thing I think earlier in the conversation, I said it would be very, very hard for me to go back to another industry at this point. The reason probably being it's incredibly intellectually stimulating. It is incredibly multifaceted. Like, it's the intersection of so many different fields and disciplines in a way that I've never really seen before. I think that people who are naturally drawn to this space tend to be very ambitious and creative and thoughtful in establishing what's essentially like a brand new industry. So it's just a very exciting, worthwhile pursuit in my mind. Very, very different from having been in some more established types of plays in the past. So yeah, if I can be of help, let me know. But I would say follow your heart, pursue it. If it's something that you want to do, I'm sure there's a space for you.
Yeah, I think parting thoughts on my end are, if you are interested in joining the space, I think sometimes people have a misconception that it can be a very intimidating space. Like, they're afraid to ask questions because it is a very technical space. But the reality is, people are incredibly welcoming and kind in the space. And I think that surprises a lot of people that are new, in that they will have a question that they deem stupid. And in fact, it's not. There's about 100 other people that were wondering the same exact thing. And whoever has the courage to speak up is usually rewarded with somebody who's willing to not only answer it, but do a deep dive and offers to go and meet them for coffee, or to hop on a video call to explain it in more detail. And that's definitely the norm. So if you are interested in getting into the space, don't be shy. Don't be afraid to look stupid. Just jump in, because I think everybody across the board realizes that for this to grow, we have to bring in more people from all different walks of life. And if there's a way that I can be helpful as the admitted non-technical person who can explain what I know and point you in the direction, I'd be happy to help. And admittedly, I'm not. I think probably the best way is to just hit me up on LinkedIn. I think that's the best way to contact me. But I'm always really excited to get more people into the space, and would love to help in whatever way I can.
Awesome. Well, thank you both very much. I think you're absolutely right on that, which is this space, the ethos of open source is very collaborative. We were all tourists or noobs at some point, and a large part of that is the receptivity and the access that you can have to people in the space is, I think, unparalleled relative to any other industry. Joining Discord channels on Twitter, the conversations there, and you can have access to practically anyone out there. So it's a very public, open space, and that's perhaps one of the more important pieces of this movement. So really appreciate both of you coming on. Really exciting times in spite of the market, in spite of token prices and all that. Builders will continue to build, and talent will continue to be intrigued and captivated by the possibilities of the space, which are just emerging. So really, thank you very much, both of you, for coming on. We'll likely want to have a follow-up episode, depending on how this market shakes up, but to remind people that the opportunities are still there in spite of everything that's going on. So thank you very much for coming on and sharing your perspective. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.